Hi, welcome back to Icelandic for Foreigners. In this video, we're going to be talking about DTD verbs, which are the second type of verb category. Remember that there are three different types of verbs: adi verbs, DTD verbs, and strong verbs. And knowing which type a verb is lets you know the pattern that it will follow in all of its different conjugations. So the way that you know that a verb is a DTD verb is there will be parentheses after the verb in the dictionary, which have either di, ti, or edi. And here are examples of three verbs that are DTD verbs, and you can know that because of the parentheses that come after. Once you know that a verb is a DTD verb, you can have a pretty good idea of what the conjugation will look like. Now, remember that there are four conjugations you need to learn for Icelandic: present tense, past tense, subjunctive, and past subjunctive. In this video, we'll also talk about the past participle and the imperative form. Not in this video will be the passive voice and the middle voice. I'll have to do that in another video. So let's start with the present tense. The general rule is that D verbs, T verbs, and V verbs all conjugate the same way in the present tense. So the example we'll look at is adreina, and that will be our pattern for all of these verbs in the present tense. So let's look at its different forms. We have ég reyni, þú reynir, hann, hún, það reynir. So notice here that the þú form and the hann, hún, það form are the same, which is the case for most types of verbs, except for a very limited class of strong verbs. Við reynum, þið reynið, þeir, þær, þau reyna. Notice here that the plural third person form matches the infinitive, which is the case for every verb in Icelandic except for að vera, to be. Alright, so this pattern right here tells you how to conjugate all DTD verbs in the present tense. The one sort of exception we're about to see on the next slide, with the verb að þekkja, which means to know somebody. We have ég þekki, þú þekkir, hann, hún, það þekkir. So notice here that the J has dropped out. If you remember from my pronunciation videos on the letters K and G, when they're followed by a front vowel, they are pronounced as if there is a J in there, so we don't actually need to write it here. But in the við form, we have to write þekkjum with a J, because the Ks are followed by an U rather than a front vowel. But þið þekkið, we don't need the J. Þeir, þær, þau þekkja, we do need the J. Alright, and that is all you need to know about the present tense of DTD verbs. Let's go ahead and look at the past tense. Now, the general rule is that the jeg form in the past tense will take either a d, t, or the in the past tense. The dictionary will tell you which one, as we've seen in the parentheses after the word. But you can also guess in a lot of cases, but I'll talk about that later. So let's look at adreina, which in the dictionary is followed by di. That lets us know the jeg form in the past tense. So we have ég reynti, þú reyndir, hann, hún, það reynti. Við reyndum, þið reynduð, þeir, þær, þau reyndu. So notice here that the jeg form and the hann, hún, það form are the same. That is true for every verb in Icelandic in the past tense. So this chart right here shows you how to conjugate di verbs in the past tense. Let's look at one with ti, að reisa, which means to raise. We have ég reisti, þú reistir, hann, hún, það reisti, við reistum, þið reistuð, and þeir, þær, þau reistu. And this is how you'll conjugate almost all ti verbs in the past tense. Let's look at one with edi, að gera, to do. Ég gerði, þú gerðir, hann, hún, það gerði, við gerðum, þið gerðuð, þeir, þær, þau gerðu. And so with these past three slides, that shows you how to conjugate basically every DTD verb in the past tense, depending on whether it takes a D, a T, or a the. Now, I told you that often you can guess whether a verb takes D, T, or the in the past tense, and that there is a pretty good way to guess. It doesn't work all the time, and it only works when you know that it's a DTD verb in the first place. But here's the basic rule. It takes a di when the last consonant of the infinitive is a bje, ed, etl, m, or n. For example, in að kempa, að meiða, að tæla, að skemma, and að reyna. It takes a ti after die, ká, kájóð, pje, s, and tie, like in the verbs að henda, þekkja, sleppa, kaupa, reisa, breyta, and skipta. One exception to that list is að senda, which means to send, and takes a di in the past tense. And then I after f, g, jóð, r, and a vowel, like að svæfa, þegja, segja, gera, and þrá. So let's look at some of these examples in the past tense. So kempa becomes kemti, meiða becomes meiti, and notice here that we don't have eth, d next to each other, so the first eth turns into another d, so we have two d's. Tæla becomes tælti, skemma becomes skemti, reyna becomes reynti, and senta becomes senti. In the next list, we have henta becomes henti, þekkja becomes þekkti, sleppa becomes slefti, kaupa becomes keifti, and notice there that we have an irregular vowel change. Reisa becomes reisti, breyta becomes breytti, and skipta becomes skifti. Notice here that breyta takes an extra ti at the end, but skifta doesn't, and that's because the t in breyta is surrounded by vowels, so it needs another t. In the next list, we have svæfa becomes svæfði, þegja becomes þagði, segja becomes sagði, gera becomes gerði, and þrá becomes þráði. We do have irregular vowel changes in the past tense for þegja and segja, as you noticed. Okay, let's move on to the conjugation of the subjunctive, which is very simple because it's the same as the subjunctive for any type of verb. So I'm just going to look at one example, að reyna, and remember that all DTD verbs and really all verbs follow this pattern for the subjunctive. So we have ég reyni, þú reynir, hann, hún, það reyni, við reynum, þið reynið, þeir, þær, þau reyni. Now, this looks almost exactly like the present tense of að reyna, with a couple differences. First of all, the ég form and the third person singular form match, which in the present tense they don't. And they also match with the third person plural, which is reyni instead of reyna. So those are the only differences. Now, as for the past subjunctive, for DTD verbs, it's the exact same as the past tense, so we don't even need to learn anything new. Let's move on to the past participle. The general rule is take off the a and add t. So let's look at some of those examples that we've been looking at and see what the past participles are. Kempa becomes kemt, meiða becomes meitt, and notice there that our eth turns into a second t. Tæla becomes tælt, skemma becomes skemmt, and reyna becomes reynt. For the next category, we have henta becomes hent, þekkja becomes þekkt, sleppa becomes sleft, kaupa becomes keift, and we have the same irregular vowel shift here as we did in the past tense. Reisa becomes reist, breyta becomes breytt, and skifta becomes skift. For the next category, we have svæfa becomes svæft, þegja becomes þagað, segja becomes sagt, gera becomes gert, and þrá becomes þráð. So a couple irregular ones here. Þegja, of course, has a very strange past participle. Segja, we have the vowel turning into an a, sagt, and þrá, when it ends in a vowel, usually the past participle just has an eth. All right, so here are some examples of the past participle being used. Ég hef ekki þekkt hann lengi means I haven't known him long. Þú getur ekki breytt því means you cannot change it. All right, let's move on to the imperative. First of all, the við and þið forms are the same as the present tense. So, gerum það means let's do it, and segið mér means tell me. But the þú form is different. So for the þú form, you have to insert the same consonant that you used for the past tense. So, reyna becomes reyndu, breyta becomes breyttu, segja becomes segðu, and gera becomes gerðu. Now, here is a list of some sample DTD verbs that are pretty common, and they're separated by category, so pause the screen if you want and write these down or if you want to learn them. Moving on though, just the last thing I'd like to talk about is some of the irregularities with DTD verbs. They're pretty tricky, and there are some things that don't seem very consistent, like the verb ad senta, the past tense is senti with a d, but henta, which looks almost the exact same, the past tense is henti. So this rule that kind of helps you guess which ending it takes, it's not always reliable. This verb, admaila, to measure, has the past tense of mailti. But maila, with the same infinitive form, meaning to speak, has a past tense of mailti. And so things like this you can't really predict. So you really just have to learn which past tense form the verb takes. There are also some tricky verbs that are actually strong verbs that look kind of like DTD verbs in the past tense, like the verb ad krevja, meaning to require, has the past tense of kravdi, which looks a lot like an ed-I ending. But the present tense is krevur. It doesn't have the I ending in the present tense. So it's not a true DTD verb, even though it has some similarities. There are a lot of verbs that fall into this category, so watch out for them. That's all I have for this video. I know that these verbs were a lot more complicated than the Adi verbs, so take it slow. Take it one day at a time, one chart at a time, and I know you can get it. Let me know if you have any comments or questions below. Tack för er. Bless, bless.